All right, we will go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, welcome to the Specialty Crops Risk Management webinar series. Today's webinar is the 4th out of our 10 webinar series, and we're excited to have you all join us. The series is funded by the North Central Extension Risk Management Center. I'm Olivia Hanlon, Education Extension Specialist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I work in the Farm, Food, and Enterprise Development Program, which works largely with specialty producers on a wide variety of education and outreach topics. Joining us today is Joe Hannan. Joe is a commercial horticulture field specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. His goal is to increase the quantity, quality, and safety of fruits grown in the state through workshops, field days, media, and personal relationships. He has worked in the industry for over 15 years, conducting research, providing education to fruit and vegetable farmers, and selling into local wholesale markets. His areas of focus include grapes, apples, and produce safety. Currently, he serves as director and co-lead of the North Central Region Center for FSMA Training, Extension, and Technical Assistance. With that, I will let you take us away, Joe.
Yeah, that whole coming up on 15 years at Iowa State thing is, I'm like, I'm not even that old. All right, let's share screen. Perfect, that should work. Let me adjust that a little bit too. Let's stick that. No, that's not gonna work, okay. All right. Okay, well, hi everybody, I'm Joe Hannan from Iowa State. I'm going to talk a little bit about fruit crop risk management. Going to talk kind of across the whole gamut of risks that we have with fruits, not just insects and diseases. So I guess I got an hour to go through quite a few different topics. Oops, there we go. Oh, come on. There we go. Before we get started though, I did want to just give a shout out for the continuing instruction credits class for pesticide applicators. This is for private, public, or commercial applicators for fruits and vegetables on February 22nd, 9 o'clock to 11:30. It's $35, and you can use the image there to take you to a registration link, or I think we can share the link after class. Okay. So that's who I am. I was hoping that I could get to know just a little bit about who you are, because I don't know everybody on here. So if I just give a quick call out, could you tell me a little bit about who you are? And I'll go down the list and just start with Amber.
Hi, I work for Risk Management Agency. So some of my crop specialties include apples, soybeans, hybrid corn seed, and things like that.
Gotcha. Welcome, Amber. I'll move down the list, and Chris.
Yep, Chris Horrocks, Little Sioux Orchard, Northwest Iowa, near Okoboji.
Alrighty, Chris, good to hear from you. And let me see, moving down the list, Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly with Appleberry Farm and Apple Orchard in Marshalltown.
Oh, hi, Kelly. And Kendra, did you want to say hi as well?
I'm Kendra Meyer with the Farm Food and Enterprise Development Program, as well as the Iowa Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association.
Perfect, thanks. Helps for me to know kind of who's on the call. All righty. So as I go through risk management with fruit crops, this is kind of the areas that I think of when we're talking risk, starting with insurance, the NAP, TAP, the whole farm program. I think that you guys have already had some speakers on this, so I'm not going to spend time on those particular topics. Then we have the environment and weather, and that's things like frost, cold temperatures in the spring or fall, that's insects, hail, drought, floods, diseases, kind of that whole 9 yards. And then talk a little bit about diversifying your options on the farm and some things that I look at when I'm looking at adding alternative crops to boost up, one particular crop that I have. So again, there's NAP, there's TAP, there's whole farm revenue insurance. They're great options out there for your revenue protection. I think we've had quite a few people take advantage of NAP here, or not NAP, TAP here this year after the derecho. There's a couple orchards in the state that have NAP insurance. The challenge with NAP insurance is that you have to track every single sale that you do down to the individual items, and so paperwork can be a little bit onerous for some of that. And then whole farm revenue is a little bit easier insurance program that's more appropriate for a lot of our farms here in Iowa. This looks at your entire income for your farm and provides guarantee on that income rather than just looking at it from a crop by crop stasis. So what I want to talk just a little bit about is diversifying your income. We grow fruit crops in the state of Iowa. We don't grow a lot of fruit crops in the state of Iowa, and there's good reason for that. And it's due to constant threat of frost, high disease pressure that we deal with, constant threat of hail. Fruit crops are just really difficult, and you kind of get one shot at them for any given season. So you can't have too many failures in a row before you get hurt. So when I look at diversifying income, I'm really looking at adding additional crops to the income. Obviously having that off-farm job, that's why I also work and my wife works again. And then some of that other merchandise that you can have on the farm. I'll talk a little bit about each of those. So when I'm looking at fruit crops, I'm always looking at what additional crops can I plant to supplement my apples or supplement my grapes or strawberries or whatever I have. And there's a couple different methods that you can go about this. One is to go from the sequential planting method where you have some crop throughout the entire season. So in this case here, I've got strawberries, and then I've got apples, pumpkins, and Christmas trees taking us into the fall. So I have kind of a steady income stream throughout the season. Nice thing about that is that any particular loss is not a loss of your entire revenue stream for the year, generally. That's not to say that derechos can't come through and wipe everything out, but generally, if you're going to have a loss, it's going to impact one crop. The challenge with doing this is that you have all different production practices, all different pests, all different equipment, whether that's planting equipment, harvest equipment, storage equipment, etc. All that is different from crop to crop in a lot of cases. And so you have a lot of extra expenses stuck into having these different crops going on throughout the season. But, the other nice thing is that, if you're looking at having a additional labor on the farm, you can keep them busy throughout the entire season. So there's pros and cons to either of them. On the vegetable side of things, we see this all the time with having somebody grow sweet corn, and then they throw in a few extra things like tomatoes and other odds and ends where we have more of a overlapping harvest season. A lot of cases you're going to have similar tillage, similar harvest, storage equipment. Your cost of entry is generally going to be less because you're able to share a lot of that equipment and things together. But this is a vegetable example, so let's look at a fruit one. So looking at a fruit one, this is what I would set up and look at having day neutral strawberries, having blueberries, having raspberries, having June bearing strawberries to start your season, maybe having some apples throughout there. So now you have sequential crops throughout the entire season. You have some overlapping labor, but you also have your labor kind of stretched out over the season a little bit. Again, what I'm really looking for when I'm looking at additional crops to stick with any one particular fruit that I'm growing is what is going to allow me to get into it with the lowest cost of entry. So, shared post-harvest equipment, shared planting equipment, things like that. With a lot of the fruits, by adding, if you're growing strawberries, by adding raspberries and blueberries to it, you're sharing a lot of the same pests. So you're not learning a whole bunch of new pests as well. So again, that further lowers your cost of entry because you're less likely to have those early season or those early new crop learning curves. And then again, you have very similar storage temperatures, similar packing containers, A lot of that just is really cross-pollinate from crop to crop. I guess going back and looking at similar pests, that also means you have similar pesticides on the shelf, again, thereby reducing your cost of entry to coming into these additional crops. It's not to say that they're exactly the same, but they're fairly similar. So I'll take a second to just kind of step back and ask, does anybody else have any crop pairs that they find work really well? Go ahead and unmute yourself or throw it in the chat if you'd like to. Like I said, I see a lot of strawberries, apples, Christmas trees arrangements fairly well because it really spreads out your season. All right, we'll keep on moving then. Okay. The other one for income revenue protection in the case of fruit crops is to simply have an off-farm job, have an additional income, have additional health insurance. This is why I work on top of having my little farm. This is why my wife just went back to work after having our little farm. Is you got to have that steady income stream. So it sucks, but it is sometimes a reality. Okay, so then the other things you see as a way to provide some additional income support is look at what additional items can you sell that can be sold throughout the entire season that are a little bit less weather dependent, but can still maybe take advantage of your market and the crops that you already have. So looking at adding merchandise, I'm thinking things I've seen people sell this year, hats and t-shirts are always super common. But a friend of mine started selling socks with their logo and things on it. You don't necessarily have a big market for some of that stuff, but again, little extra income chunks here and there. Those value-added products, the honey, the wine, the cider, the hard cider, the jams and jellies, all of those things can take advantage of stuff that you already have on farm, product that you're already growing and using, but allows you to provide a little bit of flexible income stream, or gives you an opportunity to use some of those number twos and things like that. With any of these products, at least with the jams and jellies, I mean, you can make those at home and sell them off farm or at farmer's market. If you're going to go into other retail or wholesale options, then you'd have to have a commercial kitchen for those. But again, just other things to kind of be considering to have that additional income protection. Now let's skip that one. So, okay, and then moving on with income protection is looking at market protection. I don't know if there's anybody that went through 2020 that didn't change their marketing plan in some way, shape, or form. And so that's why it's a good idea to have multiple types of market outlets. So having your farm stand or farmer's market, seeing people looking at doing some delivery options, doing some wholesale options, whether it's schools, restaurants, grocery stores, etc. But don't be just in one place, because if that one place goes down and has a problem, like restaurants this year, or even farmers markets were not great across most of the state this year, having another place to kind of readily ramp up because you're already in that market can definitely help you out as far as protecting some of that revenue. I'll just skip the blue questions. Okay, so now we'll dive into the environment and weather challenges. This is much more fruit crop specific here. So when I think of weather environment challenges, I'm thinking cold temperatures in the spring. I'm thinking hot, dry temperatures in the summer, or even low temperatures during the summer, particularly during the ripening phase. High humidity leading to high dew points in the spring, in the mornings, hail, wind, flood conditions. All those things are stuff that we have to deal with fruit crops, and they don't like those conditions. Okay, so we look at springtime, some sort of frost protection system in place for fruit crops anywhere south of Highway 30, at least in Iowa, maybe even as far as Highway North is generally a pretty good idea to have in place. Smudge pots are kind of the old method of providing heat out into out into our fields. So smudge spots provide heat out into the field, and they go up and actually not just heat the area around our plants, but they actually decrease or lower that inversion layer. And that inversion layer is a pocket of warm air up above our field. Sometimes that could be 20 feet, sometimes that could be 50, 75 feet, or even more depending on the morning. Smudge pots, or sometimes you'll see small bonfires, but any sort of direct heat energy like that, that's one of the few methods of frost protection to plants that can work for any type of frost. So we do have different types of frost. Sometimes do we just flat out have very, very cold temperatures, and other times we have frost where we have this inversion layer up here, and then cold air is pulled away from our plants. So challenge with heaters though is that they only provide heat protection in the direct line of sight. So it takes a lot of heaters in an area to provide actual protection to the plants. And as you get further and further away, you can see that you have less and less heat coming out to those further plants. Meanwhile, these plants that are nice and close to the heaters, you run the risk of actually getting too hot and causing some burning. So the other frost protection methods that we have are things like wind machines, and these are just big turbines on towers. They can be electric, propane, PTO powered. They're not cheap. They're running you about $30,000 or so, give or take. But you can provide protection over an area of approximately 10 acres, maybe more, maybe less, depending on actual temperatures and kind of the whole layout on the field. They are only good when you actually have a warm air inversion layer up in the atmosphere to pull down and warm up the crop. So they spin and turn and they pull down this warm air and circle it down in and around the trees here. So if there's no warm inversion layer up here, frost machines or these wind machines will not do any good. So if you remember and think back a couple slides where I showed the heaters can warm up that inversion layer. So if you add heaters plus a wind machine, you can further warm up that inversion layer and actually provide protection to a much larger area than you can if you just have the wind machine alone. I want to say there's only like 1 or 2 wind machines in the entire state of Iowa. I know they've been put to good use. They seem to have worked. The one thing to keep in mind when you're using wind machines, make sure if you're running it off of PTO power, your tractor does not run out of gas overnight. Otherwise, it does not work. Somebody learned that one the hard way. Not me, though. Okay, the other option is to bring in a helicopter when you have that inversion layer and actually try to pull down that warm air and spread it out over through the plant canopy. The challenge here is that helicopters are going to have to refuel fairly quickly, and if they have to run back to the airport, land, refuel, and then fly back to the orchard, vineyard, strawberry field, whatever you're trying to provide protection to, you got to make darn sure that they're not running out of gas between that 4 a.m. and 6:30, 7 o'clock a.m. time period when temperatures are dipping below 28 degrees. If you're dipping down below that and they're refueling, that couple minutes may be enough to actually cause injury. Then you also have to have a helicopter pilot that can actually find the inversion layer and catch it and pull it down. That's not something that a lot of pilots are used to doing or finding or being able to do well. So it takes a little bit of trial and error on that. I know Deal's Orchard over in Jefferson, I think they actually purchased a drone that they can fly up as well when the helicopter is flying to find the inversion layer and then radio back and forth to the helicopter to help them know what their elevation needs to be in order to catch that inversion layer and pull it down into the plant canopy. So it's an option. I want to say it runs you about $150 an hour, and you pay from the time that they're on call until the time that they're not off call. So you're not just paying for them to be in flight. You're paying for that whole night or multiple days if you've got multiple days that you've got to possibly provide protection for. So come on, there we go. Okay, so we talked about wind machines, we talked about heat. We can also look at using irrigation systems to provide protection. This is a solid set canopy system set over a vineyard. The irrigation system on these solid sets will need approximately 1 inch of water per hour per acre. So that is 27,000 gallons per hour. That's a lot of water. And then oftentimes, not oftentimes, there's very few places in the state of Iowa that can provide that much water output into an area, a meaningful area outside of, an acre or so. You could maybe scale this 1 inch per hour down a little bit. I know some of the work that they're doing in Michigan, they're trying to cut that down to 1/4 or 1/2 inch per hour. Mucked around with those systems a little bit here in Iowa, have not had great success. I know every time I've mucked around and tried with it, I just not have been able to get good coverage. And then I'm still sitting at that 1 inch per hour rate in order to try to get decent coverage. So it's an option. I'm not a giant fan of it, but it can work if you have the right system in place. And key couple things there to note is that you've got to turn the water on at about 30, or turn the water on when temperatures are about 35 degrees. And then you've got to leave it on and running all the way until you get the ice that's formed on the plants has remelted in the morning. So you can have it on for quite a while, pretty easily. So, and then you also have to play around. You got to have the right dew point in order to actually make it work. It doesn't always necessarily work. So it's one of those tricky systems to kind of muck with. A couple of them floating around in the state. I see it mostly used on strawberries here in Iowa. Folks that have ponds and using overhead temporary pipes to do it. Okay, so other things that we have to deal with: drought and flood. Those are two pretty common things. I always kind of question and wonder what is normal in Iowa. So we'll start with drought a little bit first. So when we start looking at getting into a really dry year, so not just a dry 30 days, but like last year where a good chunk of western Iowa was dry for months at a time, you can start to see nutrient deficiency within the plant. Particularly potassium can get tied up. You can start seeing some potassium deficiency there. You get the drought in combination with really high heat, you can start running into issues with just getting enough water onto the plants, and thus having issues getting to the fruit to really size up and mature. And then when you get into kind of that drought or hot dry periods, if you have hot days and hot nights, you can actually have some fruit quality issues. You need cool nights in order for the acid profile in the fruit to change and evolve and become a little bit more palatable. And so if you've got just hot days and hot nights, you have what I effectively call is heat ripening, where the fruit ripens very quickly. It may have sugar, but it still has a lot of acidity or tartness to the fruit flavor. There is not a ton that you can do if you have hot days and hot nights. If you're at least cooling down a little bit during the night, there's some things you can do during the day. You can, if you've got your strawberries or raspberries in a high tunnel, you can add some fans to try to push air through. You can add shade cloth over it. If you're in an orchard or a vineyard, you can actually set up a hail netting structure. If you're in the Iowa Specialty Producers Conference last week, had a really good talk about hail structures that are used not just for hail, but they also provide some shading onto the fruit. And they're actually seeing increased yield from putting the shade over the apples. They're seeing less sunburn, a little bit slightly smaller fruit size, but not enough to decrease the marketability of the fruit. A shade hail net type structure, it's super expensive, especially if you're retrofitting and you have to go and add new wood posts to get up over your plant canopy on top of already having the post in the ground for the actual trellis that you have. But it is an option. I don't think anybody in the state of Iowa has it, though I think somebody is actually looking at putting one in pretty seriously. So we'll see if they make progress with it this year or next year. The other thing that you could look at doing is adding some mist cooling to the environment. So if you've already got that solid set canopy irrigation system for doing frost protection on an orchard or vineyard or even strawberries, you could actually go in and turn that on, but just dial it back to set your nozzles at like basically as low as you can go. So if you can get it down under a half inch per acre per hour, quarter inch per acre per hour, and just do a little bit of mist cooling, kind of burst it, try to cool the environment a little bit in the heat of the day. You can cool it down a little. That does work. Whole other set of issues to deal with. You're going to likely to have much more disease problems because you're hot and dry during the day, but you're also pumping a lot of moisture into the environment. So you can end up with some additional disease issues, and it's going to be really difficult to justify putting a fungicide on to manage the disease that you caused by mist cooling. So not great options on the drought side. Honestly, not great options on the flood side either, short of having some sort of plastic poly covering over the plants. On day neutral strawberries, on raspberries, that's definitely economical. On June bearing strawberries, probably not. On grapes, apples, putting a high tunnel or a hay growth tunnel over the plants is probably not going to be cost effective as far as what you can do about it. As far as impacts on the actual plants, obviously you'll slow down growth. If it's springtime, you get dampening off. A lot of our diseases are directly related to moisture in the environment, either from rain or from dew in the early mornings. Planting resistant cultivars, that's fine and dandy if you're growing apples, but if you're growing grapes, strawberries, raspberries, just don't have a lot of disease resistance to those cultivars. And then of course the other option is fungicides, and we'll talk about insecticides and fungicides and stuff here in a little bit. All right, so I went through drought this past year, and after having go through, I think, second or third driest year in the last 136 years of where I'm at, multiple sources of water is really critical when it comes to fruit crops, either trellised apples, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries. These crops are all very shallow rooted, and you cannot go very long periods of time without having some sort of irrigation source. If you don't have that irrigation source and you're going into July and August and you're trying to ripen a crop, it's going to be small. It's not going to be real flavorful. And you're also trying to develop next year's fruit buds. And so if you don't have water when you're trying to mature the crop and develop next year's crop, not only did you kill this year's crop or wreck this year's crop, you likely hindered at best next year's crop. So whether that means you have a surface water source like a pond or river, multiple wells, whether you have water storage like I've got hooked up here, whether you've got rural water, something on tap to buy you some extra production when or if your current water source drops or dissipates or just becomes unusable. So rainwater catchment systems are nice, but not in a drought because it doesn't rain. Okay. The other one that I started adding when I'm talking about roof management is having a backup generator for electricity. So if you don't have electricity, and the Cedar Rapids derecho response is a pretty good indicator of why I'm bringing this in. When you're going 7 to 10 days without power, that's an issue with fruit crops. Our fruit crops cannot go that long with irrigation in July, August, or even a dry September. So having a generator to power your well or power your irrigation source, even if you got to scale back your irrigation zones and break them up a little bit, but having the ability to make sure you can still get your water out there, having the ability to fill up a sprayer tank if you need to spray an insecticide or fungicide, super critical. You don't want to muck that up or miss a pesticide application or miss an irrigation cycle. Likewise, fruit crops have no shelf life if you don't have a cooler. So you need to have some way to keep that cooler running so you can keep your daily operations going and keeping the high quality product going out the door, which it becomes really difficult if you don't have a proper cold storage system. So, and if there's questions by any means, feel free. I don't see my chat box. So if you have a question, Olivia, you want to just speak up? If you see something.
Absolutely. We don't have any right now, so.
Okay, thanks. And okay. All right, so let's talk about pest management here quite a bit. So there are key themes to when you're looking at building a pest management plan for any fruit crop, and that's involves scouting, trapping, looking for the problems in the field. We can use predictive modeling, particularly for insects, to determine when they're going to be a problem and make sure that you're around and ready to go when they're going to be a problem. Insecticides obviously are, we're going to incorporate, or fungicides depending on insect versus disease. We'll talk a little bit about exclusion and resistant cultivars as we go through as well for insects and diseases. So if you haven't gotten this yet, the new Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide 2021-2022 is now available. There's the link to get it from the extension store, or you can take your camera and open it up and hold it up to the icon there, the QR code there, and click the link and it should take you to, I think, the Purdue website to actually download it. I have hard copies coming sometime. I just haven't been told when they're going to show up. But when they do, they'll be available for free. We made major changes to the pest management guide this year. The apple and grape chapters have been completely overhauled. The rest of the fruit crop efficacy tables have been completely overhauled, and the rest of the fruit crop chapters will be getting overhauled this year, 2021, for the 2022 book. So when you open up the apple or grape chapter, the first thing that you'll see is a grape insects pest or an apple insects pest table. And so we've broken this down to when pests occur by crop growth stage and whether they're major pests or minor pests. And so the major pests are all indicated in this dark gray color here, or you can go to the QR code there and get the color version. Those are the pests that you're pretty much going to have every single year, and you're going to need to manage them every single year. The minor pests are the ones that you should be watching for, that you may have every couple of years, or some people have them and some people don't, and so they got stuck into that other lesser category. This is a great place to start if you're new to growing any particular fruit crop and identifying what you're going to need to put together for making an insect pest management plan. And we can take a look at the apple one as well. It's very, very similar. This is the best place to start when you're looking at putting together your plan, identifying what you're going to have to get, or what pests you're going to have to deal with, and what products you're going to have to start looking at buying. The rest of the book will look somewhat similar, and I'll open it up here when I get done with the presentation. We can actually take a look at it. But you'll notice now that the chapters are laid out by crop stage as they were before, but the actual tables are all the products down on one side, and then across the top you have the different pests. You have the REI, PHI, IRAC, or FRAC, so the classification of insecticide or fungicide that you're applying. All that information that you need for making pest management decisions is right there in the table. And the reason that we redesigned that table is that you can now look at multiple pests at once and see what products cover multiple pests in order to minimize the different number of products that you need to apply, or minimize the amount of tank mixing that you need to do in order to get good coverage across off the problems that or the insects or diseases that you're spraying. You also notice that the rates are there and the efficacy for each product pest combination is there, and all of those efficacy, or all that efficacy information for all the crops, apples and grapes and the other crops, have all been updated this year. There's a uniform code for everything in there, so you may see quite a bit of changes throughout those chapters. So, and of course, we appreciate feedback on those chapters and changes before we start working on the new ones. Okay, so we can predict when a pest will occur. And so this is a Japanese beetle example. So emergence occurs at about 1,050 growing degree days, starting at January 1st and accumulating on a base 50 cap 86 growing degree day accumulation. And the nice thing about when we're looking at insects with just growing degree days, we can actually use models that are available on Mesonet, our Iowa weather network, to calculate growing degree days for us at the nearest station to us. Or if you have your own weather station, you can get it to calculate the growing degree days for you as well. Looking back at Japanese beetle emergence this past year, I think I predicted emergence around the state within roughly a couple days. So the Japanese beetle model itself is actually pretty good and effective for us here in Iowa. So this is, again, one example. It's not pretty, but you can kind of see county by county of what the emergence or what growing degree days is looking like. And this one goes back to, what is that, June 7th? So a much, much nicer map is this. And there we go. This takes that same information, but kind of puts the colors and starts to shade it out based on the information that we have, and so kind of models it out a little bit better for us. And so as we're getting towards 1,050 growing degree days for Japanese beetle, now's when I'm going to start going out and scouting. I'm going to be looking at other plants that Japanese beetle really likes, as well as looking at my own crops. So I'm going to be looking at linden trees, raspberries, wild grapes, roses, all those other things that it really, really, really likes is what I'm going to be looking forward to detect emergence and get ready to go out and spray. So you can actually create your own, and I will stop sharing just to kind of walk you through how to do this. And let me pull up this guy. You know what, it might be easier to do that one at the end and walk you through how to do it rather than mucking around with multiple windows. So I'll come back through at the end and walk you through how to do it, but you can follow that QR code and it'll take you to the website. And then there's a couple things that you have to do. One, you've got to go through and edit the year. So you'll see the coding there. It says year 1 and year 2, you change 2020 to 2021. And then month 2 and day 2, you change to the current month and day to create the map. Again, I'll walk you through and show you how to do that here at the end. So insect models are pretty effective at determining and predicting when an insect will be a problem. Sometimes we start accumulating growing degree days at the start of the new year, so January 1st. Other times we need a trigger point in order to tell us when to start accumulating growing degree days. So when we're looking at grapes, when we want to calculate grapeberry moth, we need to know when wild grape blooms, and that is our trigger date for when we start accumulating growing degree days. So that's important to kind of keep track of. Same thing with codling moth. We need to catch them and track them that way. Okay, so insect models work pretty good. I like those. Disease models in Iowa, I am a little less impressed with. So disease models are really complicated. You have to incorporate leaf wetness or rainfall, and those don't always give you the same information because rainfall is just rainfall, but leaf wetness, we tend to have a lot of humidity and a lot of dew in the morning. Sometimes we have 4, 5, 6 hours, which is enough to allow a disease pathogen to get established. We have to look at overall disease pressure in the field, thinking back on looking at fire blight modeling that we do here in the state. We have to account for not only a cultivar that is really susceptible to fire blight, but we also have to account for a field that has a high history of fire blight. And by the time you account for that information, the model doesn't really work great. So not a huge fan of disease models here. And then when you're looking at trying to model diseases, you know, insects, we can pretty much work off of just growing degree days, and we can even just calculate that in an Excel file. On the disease side of things, though, you're going to really want some sort of system and software program to actually do it. So Spec Connect, the Spectrum weather stations are probably your best option there. This is a nice system that we have out at Will's Family Orchard that Iowa State put in for doing some fire blight modeling and some other things. I think this is like $1,000, $1,500, but there's other model or other cheaper versions of the Watchdog systems from Spec Connect that are quite a bit cheaper for modeling diseases and insects. So, but again, I wouldn't try modeling a disease just using Excel. It's just not going to work for you. Okay, so we should always be doing trapping, scouting for insects out in the field. Just a couple examples here. We've got red ball traps for apple maggot, the Tracy Farrakhan traps where you put a lure in for codling moth or leaf roller or grapeberry moth. All of that can go in here to help track when those pests are coming in. Sometimes then you need to count for growing degree days to egg hatch and when to actually apply. Yellow sticky cards are great to have. Spotted wing Drosophila uses a little bit different bait trap. So lots of different options out there based on the pests that you want to track and monitor. I like having traps out there, but they're not the be all end all because a lot of the insecticide lures, they're good, but they're not always great. So you still need to have eyes in the field. So that's when you come in and you do scouting, and that's just simply walking around through your field looking for pest problems. So I always look at walking through the outer edges and then doing some sort of crisscross pattern through the actual field. That would be one example. Or you could do a little bit more complicated where you're crossing both directions and walking around all outside edges. You figure that you should be doing it at least once a week, if not a couple times a week. Scout it again, that an outside perimeter again, and then scout through the interior of the field as well. I am notoriously terrible at scouting for insects. I do not see insects in my own field or in other people's fields very well. It's something I've struggled with my entire life. So if you're not good at scouting, get somebody else to do it. So in my case, I'm terrible at scouting, so I send my wife out to do all the scouting, and she is awesome because she doesn't know what she's necessarily looking for. So she takes pictures of everything, or she'll call me when she finds something in the field, and she's like, "Ooh, what is this? What is this? Ooh, we need to do something about this." And so now after 3 years of growing strawberries, now she pretty much can scout, and she almost 90% of the time she can identify a problem in the field, and then she just has to let me know, and then I can deal with it, and it works out so much better. Again, that's just because I suck at scouting. Other people are great, and if you're good at it, awesome. Okay, so should be scouting on a regular basis. Anytime you're scouting, also take notes, particularly where you see a pest starting to come into the field at. A lot of times you'll see like an aphid or a spider mite will come in a particular edge or corner, and you start seeing consistently year over year, it's going to start coming into that particular corner. So now you know that you don't necessarily need to scout the whole field. You can kind of cheat and just scout in that whole little corner where it typically comes in. It also means if you're scouting that particular corner, you may be able to get by with just doing a spot treatment rather than a treatment across the entire field. So take notes, and then also just the notes of when it actually occurs from year to year. It helps you predict on when you need to pay more attention to your scouting program. Okay, so when we're looking at diseases, remember that for a disease to occur, that the pathogen has to be present. You have to have a susceptible host, meaning the plant can actually get the disease, and then you have to have a conducive environment. And that conducive, well, we'll talk about each of those. So susceptible host just means the plant is can't actually get the disease. And so apples actually have some resistance built into them. So we have some scab and rust, and we have some fire blight resistance within our apples. But things like powdery mildew and anthracnose and botrytis across the entire fruit crop line, there really isn't any resistance built into any of those cultivars, or nothing that I would really go and buy a cultivar because it has a little bit of resistance to that particular disease. So you're going to have susceptible hosts for the most part. Yeah. Okay, so pathogens in the environment, scab, rust, all our powdery mildews, our downy mildews, our anthracnose, our botrytis, our fire blight, they're all here, present, readily available in our environment. So you can pretty much just assume that they're there, and if the conditions are right, that you're going to have them. I'll talk a little bit about conditions and stuff here in a couple slides. And then just general environment, and this one kind of covers both insects and diseases, but having good culture practices, keeping weeds and grass mowed down, keeping your plants pruned, allowing for good airflow to move through that canopy so things dry out, making sure that you're not over fertilizing with nitrogen in order to not have too much vigor. That all plays a big role in managing the environment and trying to keep down a disease. That said, there's only so much you can do, because if we're hot and humid and we have dew in the morning, there's not a lot that you can do to manage the environment from that standpoint. Okay, so kind of continuing on that disease line of thought, bloom stage is absolutely critical for all of our fruit crops. That is when they're really susceptible to a lot of our pathogens. And what happens is that you have generally wet conditions, can be cool, can be warm, depending on the pathogen, but wet conditions at bloom allows for that pathogen to get into the flower. And then as the flower matures and forms a fruitlet, it actually encapsulates that disease. And then that disease will sit there dormant until until the fruit starts to ripen. So once we get past bloom and we get to that hard fruit stage and we're not really doing any more cell division, it's just kind of sitting dormant there for 30 to 45 days, they're not super susceptible to diseases. Once we get to a point where fruit is starting to ripen, that's when those fruitlets again become susceptible to diseases, and anything that has been encapsulated will start to have a more active role and start to cause rotting or decay of the fruit. So very critical again as you're reaching ripening stage to keep diseases under control. So hit them at bloom, hit them at the ripening stage. Whenever we're looking at bloom, that's one of those instances where I always want to use one of our really good, effective fungicides. So I'm thinking a 3, 7, 11, 12 from the frat code families. Those are the ones that are going to be really critical that you want to use there. And then you'll want to use them again when you get into that ripening stage. And then use those other products pre-bloom and that midsummer time period, things like Captan, Mancozeb early season, that maybe don't have the best efficacy because you don't have super high pressure at those time periods. So, okay. So from a disease standpoint, thing that I always want to look at is what diseases are likely, what conditions do they occur in, and what is the efficacy of the application. That's why it's so hard to model a pest or a disease standpoint. So fire blight, you're looking at warm conditions, you're looking at wet conditions, and then whether it's going to be a problem, you have to look at, okay, is my cultivar susceptible? Do I have a history of fire blight? Is it warm out? Is it wet out? Not just wet from rain, but from dew. So there's a lot of conditions there that go into managing it. And then what is your efficacy of your control application? Are you getting really good 95, 100% control, or is your spray application only maybe giving 75% control, and thus you're going to have a reblossoming of that disease fairly quickly? Similar with anthracnose, it does a little bit cooler and wetter conditions typically. And then again, if you have a lot of dew or rain, it's going to really want to blossom out on you. If you didn't get good control at bloom, you're going to have a lot more problems later on when you're ripening your crop. And I'm really thinking strawberries was the one I see that more anthracnose on more often. And then, what is your efficacy of the control application? Did you do a really good job or not again? Because that will definitely dictate how fast anthracnose is going to come back and see it in your field. Botrytis is just the opposite, typically warmer, wetter conditions for that one. And keep in mind that you can have botrytis and anthracnose all in the same year if you're your temperatures are kind of going up and down a fair bit. Downy mildew that we see out in fields, that's going to typically be a warmer and wet conditions. Powdery is going to be warmer and dry conditions. So they kind of varies a little bit there. Powdery being one of the few that is more of a dry conditions disease. So anytime we're looking at choosing the right pesticide, it's got to be effective. So when I'm looking at my spray guide, I'm looking for something that has an efficacy of G or E at least. Anything that's fair or less, I'm not even keeping on the shelf outside of Captain, because sometimes you just have to have something else. It's got to be labeled for the crop. You want to look at products that have different FRAC or IRAC codes, so you're not always spraying things from the same family, and to manage resistance, it's got to be cost effective. Again, that's partly why we see so much Captain and Mancozeb used from disease standpoint. Same reason we see so much malathion or 7 used, or Imidan, because they're fairly cheap products to use. And then you also have to look at the REI, the PHI, to make sure that you can get in and harvest the crop or work with the crop when you need to. And then total application restrictions that you can, or how much product and how many applications you can make in any given year, all have to be accounted for when you're choosing a pesticide product. So this is a Japanese beetle chart of what's actually labeled for Japanese beetle. I've highlighted the ones in red that I really pull out and look at when I'm making decisions. So things like Assail, Danatel, Mustang, Imidan, 7XLR. When you look at it, you don't really have a lot of products to choose from. You've got a 4A, 3As, 1B, 1A largely of products that are going to be good or effective on Japanese beetle control. And then you look at, how long is your reentry interval? 21 hours. You got a couple that are 14 days. So you got to be careful, because Japanese beetle is, in a lot of our grapes, day neutral strawberries, raspberries, we're trying to ripen product at the same time that Japanese beetle is out there. And then also looking at that PHI as well. So a lot of these are fairly short, except for Imidan and Danatel. Brigade have fairly long PHIs, and so just be aware of that for any particular pest product combination that you're looking for. And really, this is how I look at it when I'm building my pest management plans for what I want to do and work with. I try to chart it out by pest to start figuring out what I'm going to be purchasing and using, because I always want to purchase the minimal amount of products and have the minimal amount of products on hand. Mostly because I'm cheap, but also because I don't want to have a ton of products that I gotta carry over from year to year. So then I start mapping things out and just kind of carrying through with Japanese beetle. A lot of times early season, I'll look at, okay, I'm going to apply Imidan, but then maybe I'm going to rotate into something with like Danatel or Mustang Max. And then I kind of map it out. Okay, so I've used Imidan and Danatel or Mustang Max, so I've got some rotation there. Moving into mid-season, do I have a really high pressure Japanese beetle? Do I not have a high pressure Japanese beetle? If I don't have a high pressure, I might just stick with Assail and Imidan and try to stretch that out for 10 to 14 days. If I've got really high pressure again, okay, I've got options where I can come in and make multiple applications and still rotate through my different products and still be mindful of all my application restrictions with PHI, REI, and total products per year. And then kind of as I'm going into that late season application again. And that's unfortunately kind of how I got to look at it when I'm trying to figure out what products I'm going to use when, and kind of start mapping things out. In the instance here of I've got Assail listed twice for Japanese beetle. Assail is great on Japanese beetle. It's only listed on G, but as good. But I find in Iowa, it's really more of an excellent product. But in the case of like grapes, Assail is also used for grape phylloxera control early season. So if you're using it early season, you don't get more than one application to use it for Japanese beetle later in the season. Same with malathion. The malathion has product application restrictions that you can use it you know, how many applications can you use it, or how much product can you use? And the thing is, with malathion, it's really good for spotted wing Drosophila control. It fits well for that. So I don't necessarily want to be using it for Japanese beetle control when I want to save it for SWD control later in the season. So yeah, it gets pretty difficult and complicated here when you're trying to map out all your pests. Okay, I think last slide with a couple minutes left. So the other things to always keep in mind when we're looking at risk management for fruit crops is to look at high tunnels for day neutral strawberries, raspberries, are great options for hail, wind, frost protection with those crops. The hail netting or shade screens for grapes and trellised orchards are another option out there. They're pretty expensive to incorporate and implement, but if you look at on a fresh market sales total of what you're getting for your crop on a per acre basis, one loss is going to cover a large percentage of getting that structure in place. Unfortunately, we don't have supplemental EQIP funds or anything like that to help with those hail nets or frost net systems for apples and grapes, but we do have the EQIP funds available for the small specialty crops, and now you can get more than one high tunnel funded. You can now get a high tunnel much larger than a 30 by 96 funded. I think you can do, I'm not actually sure if there's a size limitation there anymore. 30 wide is max you can go for width, but you can go much larger. And I know there's been some 120 foot plus tunnels that have been funded in the last couple of years under the EQIP program. So, but yeah, that is a whole lot of different topics. Unfortunately, not a lot of it in terribly detail in 1 hour time slot. I think we'll be going into more frost protection and environmental control systems at one of the later webinars. So you can tune in for that for a little more details there if you'd like. So, okay, there is a chat. Okay, I don't think so. I guess we have about 2 minutes if we want to take any questions or comments or and whatnot.
Hey, Joe, one of the unique, I guess, pests we had this last fall was birds. It was huge for us. Lost a significant amount of apples to birds around from mid-August until probably mid-September.
Yeah, I didn't even think of birds. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm assuming they're pecking on it. Were you pretty dry up there as well here at that time period?
Exactly, yep.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Chris, because yeah, anytime we have a dry season, if birds can't find water elsewhere, they will go for your ripening fruit. Were you at the Iowa Specialty Producers Conference with the guy that talked on the row covers for orchards as well?
I was not, nope.
Okay. He did talk about some birds that they do detract from birds a fair bit in mill structures because the birds don't have difficulty because they can't fly out or something. I don't know. They saw less bird damage from with inside their structures as well. Kind of same lines. We don't tend to see quite as much bird damage in like a high tunnel or something. But yeah.
Right. We ended up going with the digital sound devices. So it was that bad that we invested.
Yeah, I believe it. So I see a lot of people who use like the wavy things too. And I don't know. I've tried owls. Owls I think are worthless. I spend more time picking my owl up off the ground and putting it back on the perch. And so that's our time slot. Okay. I guess I'll hand it back over to you, Olivia.
Yeah, thank you everyone again for joining us today, and thanks to you, Joe, for giving us all of this information. If anyone does have any quick questions for Joe, feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, next week we have Ajay Nair, and he will be on talking about risk management for vegetable crops. So feel free to join us again next week. And then that weather patterns webinar that Joe was talking about will be on February 24th. So feel free to come back and join us for that as well. Thanks again, Joe.
Yep, and if you have any particular things that you'd like to hear in that discussion, let us know, because I don't know that we've written any of that talk yet. So we can definitely customize. So